Like always, please don't just believe me. Don't just assume it's true because I say so. Search the scriptures. Let the Bible always be the authority. Boy, if that were the case, every nut out there would be shut down. Anyways, historically, we go in the book of Genesis from creation to the end of the book ends with the death of Joseph, and we'll get to him and what that's all about a little bit later. If we're going to go with, and again, if you just read scripture and you weren't listening to a scientist tell you how many billion years or whatever, but you just read it, you would basically come to a timeline roughly about just beyond 4000 BC was the creation. That would just be reading it the way that you read it. And I think the reason things get complicated is because it's really simple until someone says, well, it's not what it looks like. And the moment it's not what it looks like, it's complicated. You know, if someone said this is a table and you go, but is it really a table? Isn't it just? Well, you know, it was simple a moment ago when I thought it was a table. Now I'm confused. Well, if you looked at it that way, what we really have is, if we're going to go all the way to Joseph, for what it's worth, is roughly about the 1800s BC. So really we cover a span of about 2200 years, which means this book covers more space and time than every other book in Scripture except for one. You know which one that is? Revelation. That's excellent because that goes to eternity. So there's no end to that. That was excellent, by the way. Nice job. That was Lois, by the way. So the major characters, obviously, we have our first man, that's Adam. We have Noah, and of course then we have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then we have this guy Joseph, who, by the way, there's tremendously strange things about this guy because he's not in the lineage of this coming Messiah. That's kind of key. I mean, from the time of Jacob, who gets a name changed to Israel, to his 12 children, you know that the fourth child, a guy named Judah, that's where the Messiah has to come from, this Redeemer of all mankind. So God tells you, okay, of these 12 children, this is the one from which all this is going to happen. You're going to keep your eye on this. Oh, but first of all, let's take a look at this other guy, who's actually the 11th of the 12 boys. And we'll see why when we get there. So that's kind of takes us into our timeline. By the way, from this point on then, everything will be very, very succinct. As a matter of fact, it's important to note that the next three books of the Bible, that's the books of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, all start with the word "and" in the Hebrew. So in other words, you kind of look at it as one, I mean, when the Jewish people call the Torah, which just means teaching, the first 5 books, it's really just written like one big long book. So, I mean, we break it up into 5, which is kind of nice, and I mean, 50 chapters is already substantial, you know. So we kind of get that idea. Now, we covered, when we did the history, some of you guys remember that, we covered the history of the entire major events of the Old Testament. We did develop creation. So I won't spend as much time on that as I will on the other historical aspects, but I do want to make this clear. What it tells us in the beginning is, in its simplest sense, this was sort of the modus operandum is God's Spirit moved, then God's Word went forth, then came light, then came life. And you'll find in every revival and every big move, you'll always see that it starts with God's Spirit begins to move, God's Word goes forth, then comes light, then comes life. And it's interesting because life as we know it can't exist without light. I think it's only a brilliant God could actually make sure light's out there before life does, because life wouldn't exist if the light wasn't there, for what it's worth. And I put this back in here where it says there was, for every day of creation, it says it was evening and then there was morning. This is why, for me, it would be very easy to believe that a day meant a day. Now, granted, he could say the day of, and that could be a time period. We get that in other points of text. But God starts this whole thing by saying not just it was a day, but it was an evening and a day. He makes it really clear that there are very distinct timestamps. And you go, well, wait a minute, there wasn't even a sun rising and setting per se at the beginning of that. God says, but it's still an evening and a day as far as I'm concerned. In other words, God invented time before he invented man. That's kind of the idea on that. So for what it's worth, the two kind of key things on that is, one is that he speaks of it specifically as a day, and the other one he speaks of everything reproducing of its kind. And I gave you the scriptures there so you can look at them so you don't have to believe me. So you can look and and again, the whole point of it is if you read without prejudice, if we read and just kind of went, what does it basically say? Whether you want to agree or not agree is one thing, but at least what does it basically say? Well, this is what it basically says, is that everything basically gave birth to its own kind. I don't know if you saw, but what is that? The well, anyways, a group of people that call themselves brilliant scientists have just put out an article today in the BBC about how Neanderthal man mated with all kinds of animals all the time, and it produced all kinds of weird people. Have you heard anything about this? Well, strange, because if you know anything about science, that tends not to work out real well. For what it's worth, God just makes clear when a dog gave birth, as strange as it was a dog. And it didn't shock anyone. I think it's kind of funny. You're probably aware that, we've adopted our second daughter. She's Chinese. She doesn't look anything like her mother or I. And it's funny when people go, is she adopted? And I just love to say, no, that's the weirdest part. I don't know, she just kind of came up and we were like, whoa, that's strange. Anyways, you get it. Because you just don't, obviously, you expect a certain thing, and that's the point, is God just makes it really simple and clear. Okay, now, he makes man unique to everything else. He makes him in his own image, his own tselem and tamuth. Literally, the word means to cast a shadow, and the idea is that man is made in a very unique way. He's made uniquely beyond every other creation, and God starts us on our first quest. And the idea is simple. A quest, like the word question, which comes from the word quest, is there's something that you don't have a completion on, or you don't have some kind of closure on, and you have to find the answer to it. And this thing is, well, how is man so unique? God has this strange board meeting. Now, I don't know if you've ever thought this through, but he has this strange board meeting that doesn't necessarily have to take place, except that we have to be audience to it. God is talking with God. Hey, you know what I was thinking? Yes, I do, but let's carry on the conversation. Well, I was thinking we should make man. How should we make man? We should make man somehow uniquely like us. Now, God not only has this conversation before man's created, but then God has to tell somebody else about this conversation later so he could write it down so we can actually read it. So, no worries. Hi. So there's a radical thing. Well, interesting. The next time we read, because everything that God makes, he looks at it and he has a simple word, one word, and the word is tov. Same word that's used today. Tov just means good. If you were to say good morning, you would say boker tov, which literally means morning good. You were to say good night, it's laila tov, it means night good. But tov still means tov to this day. It still means good. And God looks at everything and he goes, good, this is good. Until man. And it wasn't that man wasn't good, but God says in his next board meeting, it is not good for man to be alone. And there's a radical part to that. Because it is the first time that God has actually looked at anything and said it wasn't good in any way. But I remind you, I was already on a quest. Now please understand, my first time of reading straight through the Bible, trying to figure out who in the world this God is, this is how it started with me. Was I got to that point and I went, God's having this really interesting conversation, and obviously want to make me know about it. And then I get to the second one, I'm like, wow. So you created man with a capacity for companionship, with an ability to get lonely, because you made man uniquely like you. I got to chapter 2 and I was already done. I was already paying the bill, if that makes sense, because I was like, so you made me to feel lonely because you feel lonely without me. You made me to want to have a companion because you made me to be yours. I wasn't created to worship you. I wasn't created to serve you. I was created to be your companion. And that's a pretty radical thought. And I realized that once that settled in my heart, the rest of the book got very easy. I realized God gives man a choice. Man's very foolhardy with his choice, as we often can be. God spends the rest of the book chasing after him until he finally gets him in the end. The great thing is when you get to the end of the book, you realize God gets the one thing he ever really wants, and that's us. In between is this bizarre dance of God reaching out, man grabbing a fingertip, but then letting go for something foolish, and then deciding whether he really wants this or not. Well, with that, God's going to make this companion, and this companion he makes, by the way, the first surgery in Scripture and the first scar. So it says that God made a deep sleep to fall upon man, and he took a rib out of the man's side, closed it up in its place, and made a woman from it. And you're like, well, that's crazy. Well, it's only crazy because you've never seen it happen, but wouldn't it be weird if that kept happening today? the whole idea of things reproducing of its own kind wouldn't work for us, because we'd be like, excuse me, but I think that rib is mine. You know, I mean, how weird all of that would be. But you realize in this, God did this. And then again, imagine Adam being able to say, see this hole in my side? That's where I got my bride from. And I think how crazy that is to think that there would be the same place where Jesus would be pierced and blood and water would flow, and Jesus would be able to say, see this hole in my side? That's where I got my bride from. And that was before the fall. How radical that is that God would do that. And then he brings her to the man and he names her, because that's what he was doing anyways. This is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. She'll be called, and we read the word woman, but literally it's, she'll be called part of me, because she was taken out of me. What a radical thought. Now in chapter 1, when God gave the overview, the thesis statement, he did say that he blessed him. And he blessed the marriage with this: be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, and have dominion over it. In the simplest sense, a blessed marriage has authority and fruitfulness. Fruitfulness and authority are the two key things. Now why is that key? Because when man and woman fall, the very emblems of their fall will be the very things that speak of their lack of authority and fruitfulness, or the difficulty of those things. Consider this. When the enemy is speaking with the woman, by the way, only with the woman who doesn't have the direct information that God spoke to the man, that's not making her any less. He's right there and he acquiesces. He should be stepping into this information, and he is not. In the simplest sense, he's like, aren't you tired of being number two? Aren't you tired of following? You know, if you do this, you could lead. And do you realize that's been the whole problem with man and God ever since? Is that the reason we don't want God is not because we don't want his blessings. It isn't because we don't want his salvation. We just don't want him to lead. I mean, in all due respect, the big battle is over lordship, not love. Well, with that, we get the fallout. But let me say, and you have a couple slots there, emblematically, remember when God speaks about the fall of man, by the way, he speaks of it and he says that you will set your hands to that same ground, but now it's going to produce something new. What's the new addition now in a fallen world? Thorns. Thorns become the symbol of a fallen man. But to the woman, it's not thorns. To her, he says, by the way, now I'll greatly multiply your sorrow and your grief. Now it's a painful childbirth. Interesting, because do you realize when God speaks about his first coming, is it, if the curse is going to be about thorns, should it surprise me that my king would wear them like a crown on the cross? You do realize that's why Jesus wore a crown of thorns on the cross, right? Because my king paid for the curse at the cross. Do you get it? But here's the interesting thing. The second coming of Jesus, what do we read that's like? 1 Thessalonians 5:3 says, when they say peace and safety, sudden destruction comes upon them like a woman in labor. You realize God's going to wrap this whole thing up. The whole emblems of the fall get wrapped up at the two returns of, or the two comings of Jesus. The thorns paid for at the cross, and at the end of it all, everything redeemed like a painful childbirth. And matter of fact, that's even what it says, that a woman, when she's in travail, it's not pleasant. That's an understatement. But he says, but when the baby is born, she can forget all about all of that pain she went through for the joy of this thing that is before her. And he tells us that there's going to be a day after all of the grieving of this world that groans, that the newness that will come will be so beautiful, all the grief will be as if forgotten. You with me so far? Because now we have the fallout. The fallout tells us of two family lines. It doesn't take but one generation from Adam and Eve to kill each other. And what you have is the first boy, for what it's...
Adam and Eve to kill each other?
No, they're children. That's the good news.
That was what you said.
Well, you get it. The first child that's born, by the way, his name means mortal or containment. Cain. Caina. The second boy, Chabel, by the way, literally means nothing. How'd you like that name? It's like, oh, look, there's a baby. By the way, they're twins. That's pretty evident. The first one comes out, he's like, oh, it's the containment of you. He looks like you. What's the second one? Oh, I don't know. What's left? Nothing. And that's weird. But they both offer a sacrifice for what it's worth. Now, for what it's worth, and I kind of want to point that out. Try this word for me. Mincha. Try the word mincha. Mincha is the word for their offering, and it literally means an obligation or it's something like you kind of feel. I feel like I should give something. Well, and that's the word that's there when they both bring in a sacrifice. Now it's interesting because Chabel's offering was that of God's fruitfulness through an animal. It was a blood sacrifice. But on the other side, Cain's offering was the work of his hands. That's what God had told his dad, I remind you. You're going to set your hands to the field and it's going to be work. Sweat's going to come from your brow. And you realize what Cain offered was his own works. But what Abel offered was the sacrifice of faith. And at that, Cain's sacrifice was not accepted. Please hear me on this, because I'm not trying to be uncool. I'm just trying to be honest. If what you're trying to say is good enough for God is what you've done, it's not going to cut it. Because God is actually not asking for you to earn anything. What he'd actually rather do is he'd actually rather love you and give you kindness and love. The problem is a proud person doesn't receive gifts. Because that's, we're too cool for that. So hear me. God does speak personally to Cain. And he says, hey, if you offer what's right, won't you be accepted? Cain, the problem here isn't me. You know the rules. I'm looking for faith. Cain, instead of offering a sacrifice of faith, decides he's going to kill his brother instead. That becomes the story of Jesus again. You have a group of people who have everything based on works. They refuse to change that for faith and instead would rather kill the one who offers the right sacrifice. And I remind you, we haven't gotten but to chapter 4 yet, and Jesus is all over every page of this. Then God does something that most of you might not want to read through, but you did anyways if you were one of those like, oh, I'm going to do it, we're going to read through Genesis. Then we read through 2 lineages. And you're like, yay! So let me do this. Let me give each of you one of these. What's that?
You want to give her one? She didn't get one.
Okay, that's okay. That's okay. Here you go. Thank you. Thanks, Dad. So it's probably not that big of a deal. Let me ask you, how many of you can tell me what your great-grandfather's name is? Great-grandfather. You're asking me. Oh, yeah, yes, it is, Lois. It's William.
I'm pretty sure one of mine.
Now, if you were Greek, I might say Chris, because we know about 15 guys named that are Greek, and 14 of them are named Chris. One's named Tony. But, there are people, and this is a shame that Tunde's not here, because he could probably tell you that, because sometimes those guys have like 16 names, and they're actually just the family line. So if you were to run your family line, for what it's worth, a Hebrew way of doing it and a Gentile way of doing it's very different. A Gentile goes backwards. Like we would go, I happen to be the son of this guy, who happens to be the son of this guy, who happens to be the son of that guy. But a Hebrew, on the other hand, would start with the first guy and work his way this way. And that's the way we have it in both chapters 4 and 5. In chapter 4, we have that Cain family. Remember the killer Cain? And so this is what we'd read. Cain, Enoch, Irad, Mechuyael, Matushael, Lamech. That's the names of the people on that lineage. Y'all with me on that? Try that with me. So Cain, try that. Or Cain, really. Enoch, Irad, Mechuyael, Matushael, Lamech. Did you get that? That was it. That's what God gives us in the chapter. Y'all with me so far? Now, if you actually look at your handout, I've actually given you all of those names, like what they mean. Now, let's do the other side first. By the way, on the second side in chapter 5, he actually starts us with Adam. He doesn't give us that with Cain, but he does here. So, would you say Adam?
Adam.
Shet.
Shet.
Careful how you say that. Right? And the reason for that, remember, is that Abel was no longer Abel. He was killed. And so God gave them another child, and they called him compensation. In other words, God has recompensed me for the lost boy. Enosh. Kainan. Which, by the way, is the same as Cain. It's just a derivation. Say Cain, Kainan. Mahalael. Actually, in this case, Mahalalel. And then Yared. Enoch. Methushelach. Lamech. Noah. Now, did you notice there were a few of the same names? For instance, if you look at that second one, Kainan. Remember what Kainan means? Well, now take a look and fill those names in on your handout. Compare them to Cain's and you'll find the same. I do. Did you get there? So if I were to read the Cain's lineage, this is what I would be reading. Kainin enach yerad mochuya el matusha el lamech. Whoop-de-doo, right? But let me read it in the English. Humanity is dedicated to this, destruction, who smites God, presenting himself as God, the one who mourns. Is that interesting? It is to me. Let's take a look at the other side, that compensation side. Adam shet enach Kainin Mahalalel Yared Enach Matushelech Lamech Noah. Man's compensation for his mortal humanity. The blessed God, he descends, dedicated to this. His death shall bring the one who mourns rest. Now that's pretty radical for chapters 4 and 5, don't you think? On one side I have humanity dedicated to destruction. Why? Because he presents himself as God. He seeks to replace God with himself. But on the other side, God has given compensation for man in this. God was dedicated to this. The blessed God, he descends because his death shall bring the one who mourns rest. Now, interesting, that name, Methuselah, by the way, that boy was born with a prophecy because the day that he dies, the flood comes. So, I mean, if you knew that was coming and God told Noah that was the case, you realize when he dies, it comes. The moment he starts getting sick, you'd be like, uh-oh, it's coming. So these names play into it. Now, please understand, they spoke Hebrew, and these are Hebrew names. And the only reason I say that, it isn't like we can go, okay, Shante. You know, how many of you know what Shante means? I know you know what Shante means, right? You know, in America, they are the American Indians. I'm actually a part Cherokee. And so they would say names like running dog. You know, what does running dog mean? It means a dog that runs. I mean, you know what it means. And the reason I say that is these names, these words that you were saying were the words that were spoken by their language. So it wasn't just kind of like Brad. What does Brad mean? You know, that kind of thing. So for what it's worth. Now I remind you, we have two very distinct groups of people. We have Cain's family, humanity dedicated to this destruction, who smites God, presenting himself as God who mourns, the one who mourns. And then we have the side, we have Shet's family on this side. You know, God's compensation, or man's compensation for his mortal humanity is this, that the blessed God, he descends, dedicated to this, his death shall bring the one who mourns rest. We have those two families. This side, by the way, violent and still not calling on the name of God. This side, calling on the name of God. Then we get chapter 6. You all with me so far? And what we read is two very distinct groups of people unite. And when those two very distinct groups of people unite, the result is that every intent of the thought of the heart of man was continually evil all the time. In other words, you have this side that has no intention on God, and this side with an intention on God uniting, and what you have as a result of that is the whole thing is polluted. It is a corrupted group of people, and this grieves God. And as a result of that, it says he will perform his wrath. And interesting, when God introduces his wrath, do you know what he else introduces? The word chen. And the word chen means grace. God has not used the word up to this point, and now that there is wrath involved, grace is involved as well. What we do read in the book of 1 Peter is that this guy, by the way, it is a strange thought, because you are aware that until the flood, rain had never fallen. What we have, according to the book of Genesis, is water came up from the ground, and we basically God had his own sprinkler system. But we have that, by the way, and matter of fact, Egypt still uses it today. It tells us that they water by the foot, because almost all the water comes from water tables or from the Nile, and it's just irrigated. And the reason I say that is imagine telling someone water is going to fall from the sky when it's never fallen. How ridiculous that would sound. I want to warn you, we're in the middle of a desert, and I'm going to build a boat, a really big boat. You can come on if you want. Why do I need to come on a big boat in the middle of the desert? Because water is going to fall from the sky, and it's going to kill anyone who doesn't come in. But you have the choice. You have a choice. If you're going to be in here, you're going to be safe. But the choice isn't mine. The choice is yours. And by the way, does anyone know how long Noah builds that boat?
Yes.
Yeah, for over 100 years. That is enough time for you to make up your mind. Please understand, people do not like the wrath, but you've got to see the mercy. There is no place where even the most guilty individual was not offered forgiveness by faith, freedom and deliverance. The issue was not the lack of offer. The issue was the unwillingness to receive it. And it'll always be the case. Well, once the flood happens, for what it's worth, what we read is now God populates the world with the 3 sons of Noah and their wives. It's interesting, and of course I've kind of put that in there. The Sems, by the way, one son's name is Shem, which means name. Shem is where we get the Semitic people. When you hear someone say they're anti-Semitic, Semitic is from the term Shem. They're from the family of Shem, which, by the way, includes Syria as well. Ham is North African East, and Japheth is most of you, for what it's worth, the Europeans. And from that point, then, God chases us down in the lineage, and He begins showing us the family. So we've seen really the fallout, the flood, and now we see the family, and we start with a guy named Abraham. It is important to note, for what it's worth, in the book of Joshua 24, the last chapter, when he says, "Judge this day whom you'll serve, but as for me and my house, we will actually serve the Lord." He actually tells us that this guy Abraham was raised in an idol-worshiping household. That's important to note. So hear me on this quickly. And I'm like, there's so much I want to develop, but again, I'm running you through hallways. That in every culture in what we call the Sumerian, not Sumerian, but Sumerian culture basin, that's the Persian Gulf area, and that whole area that they call, in essence, the birth cradle of society, there were 4 basic kinds of gods. There was the god of production, in other words, of babies and of purpose. There was the god of provision, God who gave you stuff. The god of protection, the one who kind of protect you, and then the god of pleasure. I'll give you an idea. In Ur, or in Sumeria, for what it was worth, you have the god of Ninur, Sag, and Ki. You have the god of Anan Anu, the god of Enki and Ea. You have the god of Eli and Baal. Those are our 4 categories. In Canaan, we have Baal and Dagon. We have Astart and Anat, and then we have Milcom, Ashtar, Molech. Some of the names like Chemosh, names you might be familiar with from the Bible. In Egypt, we had everything from Apis, who was the god of production, and Aket, who was the frog, by the way, for what it was worth, to Hapi, who also doubled. Not only was he the god of the livestock and so forth, along with Isis, but apparently he was also the bodyguard for Iron Man. Nut, Horus, Set, and so forth. And then we have Sekhmet and Nehumnotep, and so forth. And then we have Hatot and Pharaoh, and then ultimately Pharaoh, who was responsible for trying to keep order in the universe. And the only reason I say that is every place had 4 basic kinds of gods. You had the god of production. He gave you purpose. He gave you babies. Because the whole point is that everyone understood that to have a baby was a miracle. They understood the idea that you could possibly have a human life and give birth to that human life was an absolute miracle. And so they always sought something transcending, and they called on someone for that. There was always a god of provision, because the idea is especially, remember, everyone was what we call agrarian. And what that means is you lived off the land. Either you ate what was on the land or you ate what was on the land. That makes sense. It's like I love vegetarians. I eat them all the time. Cows are vegetarians. Sorry. Then there's the God of protection. We knew that at night we couldn't possibly protect ourselves while we slept, and we always sought something to protect us. And then finally, there was the God of pleasure. And every God of pleasure always had the same cost. And that was you took your firstborn son and you burned him alive as a sacrifice. Now, that was, whether that be Canaan, or whether that be Egypt, or whether that be the Sumeria culture basin, or Ur, or up towards Samaria and Aram, everybody did this. Now, I'm not saying it was right, I'm saying it was wrong. But it was what was understood as cultural. Now, we look back 100 years ago or 200 years ago, and there are things that were culturally acceptable, and here's a classic one, dare I say it? Slavery. It was culturally acceptable. We look back and see it as an abomination now. Because we're culturally removed enough to be able to say, that's not acceptable. Does that make sense? But people that were we could say were decent people under other pretenses, or under context, still did this. And we'd say that was still wrong. Do you see what I'm saying? And the reason I say that is, just because it was culturally acceptable does not mean it was right. I mean, in the late 1930s and 1940s, in much of Germany, there was a whole other group of things that were happening socially and culturally that were to go and completely wipe out the Jewish people. And it started in a lot of these places. And when you think of things like Kristallnacht and that kind of thing, it was culturally acceptable to be able to, to the point where you would have to sew on a Magen David, a Star of David, on to a Jewish person, or the term ghetto that we think now is so cool in hip-hop. Was, by the way, it's an Italian term. It means iron bars. It's where they shoved all the Jewish people in Italy. And the only reason I say that is that there's always been cultural abominations in every culture. But when you take a person steeped into that particular culture, and you have to start ripping that stuff out of him, well, it's a pretty radical transformation. Well, with that in mind, this guy Abraham, who, by the way, is called at least 4 different times God's friend. How'd you like that title? I love this is where God goes with it. He says, but you, Israel, are my servant Jacob, whom I've chosen, the descendants of Abraham, my friend. What do we know about the guy? He's 75 years old and still living with his dad. Failure to launch. But God tells him it's time to leave. And to leave his family behind. His family in regard to his mom and dad, take his wife. He has no children, and he gives him a promise. And the promise is, you'll be the father of nations. That's the first thing he hears. And for what it's worth, what we'll find is Abraham is an altar builder. Do you know how many altars he builds? 4. 1 for each of those gods. See, his whole journey is the journey every one of you are on. And that is the journey of discovering that this God that we seek to follow is actually everything we need. But it is a rough road to reconciliation. So what happens? God gives him this promise. Genesis 12, he says this, get out of your country, from your family and your father's house, to the land I'll show you. I will make you a great nation. I'll make your name great. You'll be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. And he builds an altar there in Shechem at the terebinth tree of Moreh. And I would have to say this is his first one. This is the God. Which God is this? This is the God of production. This is the God who gives us children. The next verse, what we read is he moves again, and he moves to a place in between Bethel and Ai. And a great famine hits, and he builds an altar. And a great famine hits, and he leaves Israel as we know it today. And he goes down to Egypt. And as he goes down to Egypt, he pulls that whole "say you're my sister" thing. Reading at this time, I'm more astounded than ever. Because I realize that in Middle Eastern culture to this day, there's a man called a shashbanin. And the shashbanin is the broker for the wedding. There are still cultures, there's African cultures, and even some European cultures where there's such a person. The person that sits down with the father of the bride-to-be and works out the deal. How much for your little girl? You know? And it's like, and the only reason I say that is the guy that's actually brokering the deal is the husband. Is that a weird thought? Because to me, I'm shocked at this thought that he's selling out his wife to stay alive. Now today you'd hear guys say, honey, I would rather die than see you with another man. And he's in essence saying, I'd rather see you with another man than die. And here's the worst part, is that Abraham gets pretty rich off of the deal. Which tells you she really was. I mean, this girl, she's 65 when they left. She must be some kind of fine to be able to clean out the livestock cages for this gal. And it turns out, and you know what God does? Is he strikes Egypt with plagues. Does that sound familiar? That's a little precursor of coming attractions. And finally Pharaoh goes, something ain't right here. Is this really your sister or is it your wife? Now please hear me in this. Technically sister, by the way, is kind of like, the closest we have is cuz. Yo, cuz. Now, in some cultures, cuz just means anyone you kind of know. Right? Yo, man, cuz. But in some, it's like it's my cousin. Now, but to say someone's your brother or your sister is to say it's anyone that's related to you. And what he says is, well, technically, she is related to me. But I also happen to be married to her. And he goes, in Pharaoh and politely, in so many words, goes, get out of here. And he does. But he takes all that stuff with him. And boy, they brought more than some souvenirs back with them. They also brought a little honey named Hagar back with them, too. And it's like, what did you get from Egypt? You know that shirt? All I got was this lousy Egyptian shirt? You know? But it's like, no, they brought back a slave girl from Egypt. And I'm telling you, it just gets... And here's the point in it. You go, well, how could God use such a nincompoop as this? Because who else would he use? Aren't we all nincompoops? Aren't we all... I mean, can I just be the one to be honest and say, aren't we all selfish jerks in one way or another that are full of fault? If God wanted to find someone lacking fault, the only person left to use is himself. But God does use people. And just because it's recorded in Scripture does not mean it's right. Doesn't mean he endorses it. Because what he's showing you is a person on their journey of discovering that God is what he needs. Now, what would that look like if God did that story for you? Or for me? And on the journey, he had to figure out that this wasn't going to satisfy her. On the journey, she had to realize this isn't what she was really looking for. A lot of our journey is riddled with lots of mistakes of, whoops, wish I hadn't done that. So he builds this one about, remember, the second one, he goes to the famine, he comes back. You know where he goes back to? He goes back to that second altar. And he's like, oh my goodness, God, you provide. So wait a minute, you're the God of production and the God of provision? Yeah, actually you are. You're both those things. Now, do you really trust that? Do you really trust it's God's job to provide for you? Now, I'm not telling you quit your job, lay at home, and wait for money to show up at the door. Because God can provide you a job. And if he provides you a job, my suggestion, it's a single one word. Work. Do it then. Work. But it's still God who gives it to you. And gives you the ability. But we've had to live off of faith for so many years now. It's a crazy thought. I mean, we're putting a kid through college, through university. Is that a crazy thought? Who lives in another part of the country? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Grandma.
Yeah. And it's like, but you know what? It's always been God's provision in it, one way or another. And it's like, if the people didn't provide, we'd have been gone in a month. We don't have anything that we're sitting on. And there's something crazy cool about the fact that that's what God does. Now, then he builds a third altar, for what it's worth. The third altar is in Hebron. And as he builds the third altar, that's when we find out about his... By the way, he's gotten so rich that his nephew who's with him, his brother, whose name, by the way, is Snorter, for what it's worth. Who names their child that? Well, I guess there's probably a good reason. And but he has a son named Lot, And that's his nephew, that's Abraham's nephew. And so he takes them, and now they're so rich they can't stay, the land can't sustain them. So he's like, look, you go left, I'll go right. You go left, I'll go right. And he looks, and Lot looks around, and he sees the valley of Sodom, which, by the way, is the Dead Sea area today. And he looks and he goes, green, beautiful, I've got a lot of animals. I'll take that. Abraham goes, ahead, you go ahead and do that. Then I'll go the other direction. And God says, I'm going to give it all to you. Don't worry, Abraham. And he builds an altar. Here's the crazy part, and I don't know if it's easy to miss this. Lot has lots and lots of animals. He's a shepherd. But now he's in the city. What is a guy with a lot of animals doing in the city? Neglecting his animals is what he's doing. How is a shepherd work in a big city? It's like a cowboy. He just don't work in the big city because he can't get his cows and he misses his horse. Yeah, you get the point. And the whole idea of it is ultimately what you find is that there are 4 kings that are fighting 5 kings, and Lot becomes part of the booty. He gets taken captive, the whole group. You know what happens? Abraham now, this is how rich Abraham is. He's still Abram at this point. He actually has 316 guys in his house, 318 guys, that were born in his house, that were raised just to be his army. Those are servants in the house. 318 of these guys that are like, oh yeah, that just happens to be my bodyguards. This guy got entourage. And they go and they take on then these 5 united kings, this sort of confederacy, and they win. They get it all back. And that third altar is built because God is not just the God of production and provision, but he's also the God of protection. Oh, but there's one more. Remember how God said you're going to have a son. And Abraham offers 2 compromises. He's like, I believe your promise. I just have a problem with the practicality. He goes, you should take my oldest servant. His name, by the way, is Eleazar. That's really important because Eleazar means God the helper. Some of you are familiar. That is the New Testament title for the Holy Spirit. Now, for what it's worth, he goes, you should just have him. I'll adopt him. That'll be my son. And God goes, no, he's got to have to come from your body, boy. And so he's like, and then his wife comes afterwards, compromised too. And she goes, well, he said your body, not mine. Here's my beautiful, cute little maidservant. And Abraham, being that godly man, goes, okay, and with that, and by the way, who's that maidservant? It's the girl from Egypt. It's Hagar. And with that, Ishmael is born, who God, by the way, promises will be a wild man against every man, and every man will be against him. That's what God told us, by the way, in the book of Genesis. And with that boy is born. But then God does let Sarah get pregnant, and a boy is born, and that boy's name is Laughter. Ischach. Because what a joke. He's 100, but don't worry, his wife's younger, she's 90. And the baby's born. And you go, that's impossible. And I'd say, under any other circumstance, I fully agree. But I'm not going to try to get weird about it, but I want to say there is an act of faith there. Through all of this, God doesn't miraculously just put a baby inside Sarah. Changes her name, by the way, from Sarai, which means contentious, to Sarah, which means princess. And his, from blessed father to father of multitudes, from Abram to Abraham. But somewhere down the line, Abraham has to look at his wife and go, honey, we got to give this one more try. And I know that sounds weird. I'm not trying to be weird, but an 89-year-old woman is told that by a 99-year-old man. And she has to go, okay, let's give this one more try. After how many years of wanting a baby and not getting one? Well, ultimately, God says, in that chapter we have a hard time swallowing, where he says, no, I want you to take your son, your only son, whom you love, and offer him as a sacrifice. Holech. Holech is the word for sacrifice here. And it's the second time this word is used. The first time was after Noah landed and offered a sacrifice to God. Different from Cain and Abel's word. Remember that word there is nicha. Why would God make Abraham do this? Now, we're aware of the story. The child is not sacrificed. Instead, God provides a ram in the thicket, though we're looking for a sech, the lamb. We talked about it the last time. Because Abraham knew that the God of pleasure deserves the sacrifice of his firstborn. But he wasn't going to sacrifice his firstborn. But what Abraham was going to realize is that this God that he's following is the only God that need be followed. He is everything you're looking for. But I want to let you know, I think that Christianity in general has done a fair job to mid job with the first three, but done a terrible job with the fourth one. We do not show the world that our God's a God of pleasure. Because we even feel like the word's dirty, don't we? It almost feels like a weird word to say, pleasure. That seems so selfish. But it tells us that God gives us all things on this earth to enjoy. Now, he doesn't say that we should go out and smoke pot, we should go out and shoot heroin, and we should be raping people. That's not the point. What he's saying is that in his presence is the fullness of joy, and to be honest, God knew the word pleasure because he put man in the first place in Eden. In Eden, cheden means pleasure. In God's opinion, what pleasure is you being with him and him being with you. Because that's all he really wants. Everything else becomes complications of that. So what Abraham has to learn by the time he's done is that God, all the things that the world has sold me they could offer me, you're actually the only place where I can find them for real. Now, I'll be honest with you, I'm not there. Any of you there yet? Or, intellectually I know all those things. Intellectually I know that he's all of those things. I know he's my provision, and I know he's my protection, and I know he's the one who bears forth the fruit and gives me purpose. And he's also the one what makes my life amazing. But I'd love to tell you that that's actually where I dwell every moment and with every breath. I wouldn't be honest to tell you that. Because there are moments I get distracted. It's like spiritual ADD. And when I look long enough at something shiny to think, oh, maybe I could add this. But when you've got perfect, there's nothing you can add to perfect to make it perfecter. And I've learned that the walk with a Christian is accepting a gift that only God could provide. And learning this is that he's everything we need. Well, what's interesting is this guy Isaac's the guy that gets the least amount of press. What we do read basically he was a son of promise, a miraculous birth, who, by the way, went on a 3-day journey, good as dead, and came back alive again. Does that sound like familiar information? By the way, God not only introduces the word obey and the word worship, but also the word love in that chapter with the offering of that firstborn. But interesting, the next time we see the son is when he's getting his bride. Now, take a breath for a moment so you can gelatinize all of that information so I can move forward. A lot of info yet? Is it good though? I'm having a good time. I have to say one other thing for what it's worth about Abraham, Father Abraham. Do you know that after Sarah dies, he marries again? You know what I'm saying? He's 100 and who knows what. Is she a gold digger? I don't know. I do know this. She bears forth a 6-pack of kids. One of them is Midian from the Midianites. It's where they come from. But listen to what happens to them because it's really important. It says that he took these children and he gave them gifts and he sent them east. Why is that important? Because God had promised that all the children of Abraham would come back when the Messiah would show up. Now, would that include the sons of Keturah? They're still Abraham's children. Interesting, because when I look at the book of Psalms, it tells us what they'll be bringing. You know what it says? Gold and incense. Dromedaries covering the territory. Does anyone know what a dromedary is? It's a camel. There's 2 different kinds, one hump or 2. Should it surprise me then that God tells me in the book of Matthew that when Jesus is born, men come from the east bringing gold, frankincense, and myrrh. It's exactly what God promised when Abraham sent away his children. For what it's worth. So what do we have with this situation with this son now? The dad, Abraham, says, follow me on this. He sends his oldest servant. Do you remember what his name is? Eleazar. Does anyone remember what it means? God the helper, the Holy Spirit. He sends him and he goes, now I need you to go get me a bride. I want you to get me a bride. Send it to my brother's side. Distance enough relatives so it's not freaky and weird, but I want to make sure it's someone from there. So go there, and I love this. Please hear me in this. Bring gifts so they can see the gifts. And the servant, Eliezer, asks a perfect question. What if she won't come? It's a good question. And he goes, you know what? Then you're off the hook. I love this. It's like the helper comes and says, the groom wants you. This is just a hint of all that he has to offer. And he does. He's got nose rings. And I mean, imagine she's like, hey, sticks this thing up her nose. Well, it's like, how fun is that? And he comes there and he goes, this is what I'm asking, God. I'm going to show up at this well. He's got 10 camels. And he goes, and by the way, for what it's worth, a camel can drink 100 liters at a time. Just want to put that out there. And he's got 10 of them. Do the math. How much water is that? 1,000 liters. Y'all with me? And he goes, and a woman comes by, and if she, I'm going to ask her, could I have some water, please? And if she gives me water and she goes, yeah, how about I water your camels too? I'll know that's the girl. Let's face it, anyone that wants to put out 1,000 liters from a well, that's a girl you take home. Does that make sense? So what happens is, that's for you single guys, that's a word. And so what happens is he shows up at this well, and as he shows up at this well, he sees this girl, and you know what it says? She was beautiful. So he looks and goes, oh, and he runs over to her. Can I have some water? He's like, he's like hoping, let's face it, you want to bring back someone that your master is going to go, oh yeah, that's cool. And so he's like, can I have some water? And she goes, oh yeah, sure. And while I'm at it, why don't I water your camels? And he's like, oh, whose family are you from? Where are you from? She's like, oh, I happen to be from Nachos, and so forth. And he's like, this is everything I'm looking for. Oh my goodness. Well, I need to talk to your family. And he's running the Shashbanin role, right? He's running the role of bargaining for the girl, like God the helper would do. The brother, who, by the way, happens to be kind of a used car salesman. I'm not trying to pick on you if you are, but he's like kind of knows how to wheel and deal. I mean, he gives her all these things. She comes back and she's got like bling bling on all over the place. She got this Rolex and a big nose ring and all this stuff. And he kind of looks and he goes, where'd you get that? She goes, oh, this guy, he was really nice. And he goes, and you didn't invite him over to our house. So they went and get him. And he's like, look, she should be married. My master sent me to get a bride for his daughter. And he goes, oh, by the way, here, mom, and here, brother. And he gives them gifts. And they're like, that's good. Okay, yeah, okay, this is a good deal. And we're going to find out we're going to play into this later. But what happens, they're like, yeah, well, don't let her go right away. But every day you stay, you're supposed to offer more gifts. So, like, you should stay 10 more days. See how that works? And, it's kind of like, it's like if you were staying at a B&B, right? You're like, it's going to cost you another nose ring, and he's like, no, I really should go right away. He goes, well, let's ask the girl. And the girl had a choice, and she goes, I'm going. And so she goes. And with that, she sees him at a distance. She says, who's that? And she goes, that's the guy that is going to be your husband. She's like, oh. And she puts a veil on her face. He takes her and makes her his bride. And that becomes the gist, the majority of what we read about Isaac. We have this miraculous son who was offered as a sacrifice, comes back alive again and gets his bride. Beautiful, beautiful thing. Which takes us to our last bits. The big guys, right? So hear me on this. By the time we're done, Abraham has built all of his altars. He's offered all of his compromises, and we see that that's obviously not the case. There is one other thing, and I want to kind of put this out as thought. in the middle of all this, I remind you, God does destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And he tells Lot, get your family and get out, because we can't do this until you're gone. Twice God poured forth his wrath, and neither time would he do so until his own people were away from the harm. I think that's noteworthy. But here's the thing, and it's like this still echoes and haunts me. Lot tells his son-in-laws, and they mock. They're like, whatever. But then Lot lingers. He's like in no hurry. They have to pull him, get out of here. And he goes, I want you to get beyond those hills and don't look back. And he goes, we can't go that far. How about we just go to this place called Zoar, which by the way means insignificant. And when they get there in Zoar, and once they get to Zoar, God starts pouring forth his wrath, and his wife looks back like she wasn't supposed to. Most of you are familiar with the story. But here's the thing that haunts me. If Lot had gone beyond the hills where he was supposed to, she couldn't have looked back. Because she would have been, the whole thing would have been obscured by the mountains they would be hiding in. And I think about that when I think about the cost of my own compromise on my family's lives. Something to consider. So, this Rebecca, who happens to be Isaac Laughter, his wife, she has a very troubled pregnancy. In the troubled pregnancy, she's like, what is the problem? And God tells her, there are two nations in your womb. They are not happy with each other, and they are already fighting, and they haven't even left you yet. He goes, but I want you to know, contrary to all culture, the older will be served, the older will serve the younger. The older comes out, and he's red and hairy, so what do they call him? Red and hairy. Esau and Edom. The younger one catches his heel, which in essence would be the idea of trying to pull him back in to come out first, which would be cheating. And they call him Yaakov, which means heel catcher. So let me ask you, give me a term, a good British term for a cheat. But a couple of you guys even work at places that kind of hedge that stuff. If a guy tried to cheat, what would you call him? A weasel. That's good. Is that good? A thief. Yes. Oh no, thief. Yeah. But see, these are titles we give them, but it isn't anything that's like an action. You know, we were saying like surfing, they would pull your leash to get your position, so we call them a leash puller. That'd be the idea. You know, there's always kind of like, you know, we could say like a juicer. You know, among the professional athlete world, that guy's a juicer. That means they're doing steroids. They're cheating. That makes sense. And you know, the moment you're a juicer, man, you're out of this, right? The reason I say that is you're raised with the name ripoff, is the idea. Thief. What's your name? Thief. I'm a thief. And ultimately, what we'll find is he lives up to that name. I remind you, his mom is the gal that came from the other side. Remember that? Who has the brother that's like, we should stick around. She got some of that in him too. But dad doesn't he prefers the older boy. Why? Because he's red and hairy. Why would you prefer a red and hairy guy? Why would anyone prefer a hairy guy? Sorry. Because he's a hunter and dad's a carnivore. But face it, who better to hunt than a guy that looks like a wild animal? He just kind of walks among them, and then he just takes them because he's one of us. I mean, what a great hunter. Jacob, what we read, is a mild man, a man of the tents. You know what he was? He was a mama's boy. So mama loved Jacob. But dad loves the hunter. And he prefers him, even though the prophecy is already out there that the younger will be served by the older. So what happens? Dad's now so old that he can't see, and he tells the oldest, Esau, he says, go and kill me something so I could eat it, and then I'm going to bless you. I'll bless you. I'm going to give you the family blessing. Today we would call that a will. But it's a spiritual as well as just things that you own. But as he runs off to go and do his killing, mom hears it from the kitchen, and mom tells her boy, Jacob, hey, dad says this is the case. I'll go and cook it up while he's out killing. Pretend to be your brother. He's like, but I'm smooth. And he goes, Dad's going to notice somewhere down the line. And he says, and then it'll look like we're trying to deceive him. Look like we're trying to deceive him? You are trying to deceive him. That's why it looks like that. All right? She goes, don't worry, I got that covered too. So she takes one of his brother's stinky clothing and puts it on him. And then she takes the animal skins of a ram and covers the back of his hands and his neck with. How hairy is this guy? The dad's going to feel lamb wool, like a ram on him and go, oh, yeah, that's my son. Right? So now he's got his brother's stink on. He's covering him in all this. And he comes in and he's like, hi, Dad. Hi, Dad. Got your food. And he's like, wow, you caught that quick. How did that happen? He goes, oh, it was the Lord. He just brought it right to me. All right, okay. You sure you're my son? Yeah, I'm sure. I'm your oldest. Are you sure you're my oldest? Yeah, I'm sure I'm your oldest. Well, come here then. And he comes in, he goes, and he touches the back of his neck, and he's like, yeah, that kind of feels like my son. And he goes, you smell like the pasture that has been blessed by the Lord. What is a pasture blessed by the Lord? It is a corral full of animals. You know what you smell like? You smell like poo. You smell like, have you ever been around dairy cows, for instance? Woo, man, when it says God got a cattle on 1,000 hills, you could live near there. I'm not into it. Anyways, but he's like, you smell like them. All right, well, he eats them and he blesses them. And he gives him the blessing that was rightly his anyways. And then, as you expect, older brother comes in after that and he's like, all right, Dad, I've got the food. And Dad goes, wait a minute. What do you mean you got the food? I already had food. I'm full. What do you mean? I just killed and ate it. Who are you? I'm your oldest. How could you be my oldest? My oldest was just in here. No, he wasn't. I'm his oldest. You can imagine he's like, oh, and then Esau it rests on him. He got ripped off by rip-off. So he does what any good brother would do. I'm going to kill him. I'm going to kill him. So Jacob flees. And he gets out. And he runs. And as he runs away, where does he go? He goes back over to Uncle Laban. Remember, that's Mom's brother, the used car salesman? And that man knows how to rip him off. Rip-off gets ripped off. He gets out-ripped off by Uncle Laban. By the way, for what's worth, Laban means Whitey. So let's just say rip-off gets out-ripped off by Whitey. Uncle Whitey. There you go. But ultimately, and now I'm trying to do this quickly, but I want to make it clear. Ultimately, in all of that, God's got a purpose. Here's the sad part. God had already promised this to Jacob. But you know what Jacob never was able to do? He was never able to tell his children how God did it. And there are times where you could take matters into your own hands. But then when someone said, well, how did God pull through on that? You wouldn't be able to say anything. You'd be like, well, I'll tell you how God pulled through. I ripped off my dad, my blind dad, by pretending to be my brother and stunk like him and stuff. And Mom made food. That doesn't sound like God provided in that situation. You see, Jacob's got to learn that too. But ultimately what happens is one of Laban Whitey's daughters is beautiful in face and form. You can figure that out. And he says, what do I have to do for this? And he works 7 years for her. And then ultimately, on the night of consummating the marriage, Dad slips in the doozy, and ain't Rachel, it's her older sister, which means that Dad is to say to the older sister, honey, no one's going to marry you when you got your cute sister around. Pretend to be your sister. Does that sound familiar? Of all people to rip off? The guy who pretended to be his brother now gets shifted by a girl that pretended to be your sister. Oh, you can't make this stuff up. And this is one of those places where you got to check the package before you buy it. And with that, now he's officially married. But he's married to weak-eyed Leah. I know. And so ultimately he goes, and imagine, so he's got to go back to Uncle Ripoff and go, you ripped me off. And he's like, well, she's the older one. Technically, she has to be married first. You can get them both. It's a package deal, 7 more years. And Jacob works another 7 years. 14 years. Ultimately, it'll be 20 years before he actually gets this. But it says that the years were like days because of the love he had for her. I love that. Well, nonetheless. And ultimately, you get the idea, well, here's the issue. Now you've got 2 sisters that have sister rivalry. Now, how does one get better than the other? Babies. And that weak-eyed Leah, she is productive. The first 4 children that are born by her. And so the first one, see a son. Oh, now my husband will love me. Second, he's heard my cries. Now my husband will love me. Third, Levi, attached. Now my husband will be attached to me. Fourth, Judah, which means praise. Oh, now my husband will praise me. You see, all she really wants is to be loved. Well, Rachel realizes she ain't getting anything out of this deal. So she goes, I happen to have a maidservant. Technically, if she gets pregnant, I could call it my own. So what happens is Jacob, being, who Jacob is, he's like, well, this deal's getting sweeter by the moment. Okay. So she gets pregnant and she names the first one Dan, which means judge. God's judged my sister by my maid getting pregnant. And it just gets worse. Then she has another one, Naphtali, and then Leah realizes she isn't having any babies anymore. She goes, I happen to have a maidservant, so she throws that into the deal now. And Jacob gets 2 more babies out of that. And so that's Gad and Asher. Gad means a troop. She's like, oh, look at the troop I have now. Asher, well, now I'm happy. Now understand, at this point, Jacob's got 4 wives. Now, this is not God complimenting anyone and going, attaboy. He's going, look at how crazy this gets. Finally, Leah gets pregnant again. She goes, you know what? I'm getting a couple more out of this deal. Leah, out of the 12 boys that are born, 6 of them are born by Leah. Issachar and Zebulun. And with that, finally, Rachel gets pregnant. 10 boys have been born. A boy that's born, his name is Yoshef. And you know what she calls him? God will add another. Isn't that sad? One wasn't enough. How'd you like to be born and say, don't worry, another one's coming? That's your name. She goes, and then she turns to her husband and goes, give me another son or I'll die. Ironic, she will die having the second. And his name ultimately is Benjamin, which means son of my right hand. And ultimately, Jacob knows his brother's coming, and he knows he's going to die. And in the middle of the night, he gets cornered by someone, and he wrestles for his own life all night, thinking it could be his brother initially, I would imagine, but ultimately it turns out it's not. It's an angel of the Lord. And finally, sun is rising, and the angel goes, we're done with this. And he just touches his hip, and it pops out his socket. Any of you ever have a bone out of a socket before? It is not pleasant. You are right. But the hardest one to rip out of the socket's your hip. And it does. And Jacob falls and he grabs his ankle and he goes, bless me, bless me. And understand, remember, the lesser is blessed by the greater. In other words, he's saying you win. He's tapping out. And he goes, well, I'm going to change your name. You're done. I'm done calling you ripoff. For now on, I'm going to call you struggled with God and won. Israel. Sarai, like Sarah, Sarai means contended with. That's Sarai. Israel literally means contended with God. How did Jacob win? By surrendering. And that will always be your victory, is surrendering to who he is. Just like mom with Rebecca says, look at what if she says no? Well, you're off the hook. But the offer is there. The offer's there. It's whether you'll accept it or not. Which goes to our last thing. And forgive me, I'm trying to do this quickly, but I'm trying to do it clear. Ultimately, at that point, we do know that we're going to be looking for that 4th boy of Leah. By the way, even though she wasn't loved as much by her husband, God loved her, and he would choose the Messiah to be born from her. And the 4th boy, Judah, he would be the one from which Jesus would be born. But God spends the rest of the chapter, or the rest of the book, by the way, which, by the way, he gets more press than anyone but Moses and Abraham, actually more than even Abraham, in the Torah, is a guy named Joseph. So listen to this quickly. Joseph's beloved by his father, hated by his brothers, foreordained as the ruler, conspired by his brothers, cast away to be forsaken, sold for the price of a slave, handed over to the Gentiles, falsely accused, numbered with his transgressors. He actually sees with him one die that is guilty and one that it receives deliverance, raised to second in command. Every knee bows to him, unrecognized by his brothers, but his brothers have a season of trouble first, then finally restored and saved, and becomes a savior of the Gentiles and the Jews. You know what's interesting? It's exactly the story of Jesus. That's why he gives us this story from Genesis 37 all the way to Genesis 50, is he goes, you need to know, this is what's going to happen in that redemption. He's going to be born among his brothers, ordained to be great, but even in that rejected by them, sold for the price of a slave. 30 pieces of silver that Judas received is the price of a slave. He was accused falsely. And though he was accused falsely, there were two guys, I remind you, that were, as he was put in the pit, that had dreams. One was a baker, and the other was a cupbearer. The cupbearer was restored. Does anyone know how long? 3 days. The baker, on the other hand, would die. One is condemned and one goes free. And Jesus on the cross would turn to one and say, "You will be with me in paradise," where the other one would die a guilty man. Interesting, because the bread is broken, but the cup of wine is restored for what it's worth. And with that, he's given deliverance, unrecognized by his brothers, but ultimately raised to second command. And then ultimately every knee bows to him, and they confess him, and he becomes the savior of the Gentile world and the Jewish world. So as a result of that, Joseph ultimately restores his family. And as they're restored, he says, "There's a famine. Why don't you guys come down and live with us?" And as you come down and live with us in Egypt, that's what brings 70 people, the entire nation of Israel at that point. Remember, Israel's just a guy. So those 12 sons become the 12 tribes of Israel. The same way we could say, the 12 tribes of Roberto, or the 12 tribes of Jaden, or the 12 tribes of Shamar. That's just 12 kids you had that had a bunch of families. And they all moved to Egypt. The way this book ends is this Joseph dies. And as he dies, he's buried. But right before he does, and this is my last thing, is that Jacob, Israel, blesses his children. And as he blesses his children, this is what he says. He says about Judah, "The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh comes." This is a prophecy, mind you, 2,000 years before Jesus, that says that there will always be a lawgiver among the people of the tribe of Judah, and they'll have the right of rule until that Messiah comes, until Shiloh comes. Why is that important? Because do you know when the atheist movement started among the Jewish people? 7 AD. Because in 7 AD, Coponius, who was the ruler before Pontius Pilate, a few rulers before, but of the area of Judea, removed the right of capital punishment among the Jewish people, and they said the scepter departed. Where's our Messiah? How was he presented? But if you do the math, Jesus could not have been born in 0. First of all, there is no 0. Probably where it was 1 BC and then 1 AD. Because Herod the Great died in 4 BC. Jesus was born in 4 or 5 BC. So if I do the math, I have one account of Jesus after his babyhood, before his adulthood. Does anyone remember the one thing that is recorded in Scripture of Jesus? When he's in the temple, how old is he?
12.
He's 12 years old. Excellent. Why would a 12-year-old boy be brought into the temple? Bar mitzvah. It is the day when you present your son. So if I do the math, and he's 12 years old, and he was born in 5 BC, when is he presented in the temple? 7 AD. Jesus is presented in the temple as the son, and then the scepter is removed from Judah. Just like was prophesied 2,000 years before that. Crazy as that is, to the day. I just love how God works. Now look at this. We go to prayer, and I know there's so much more to say, but I've already said too much. And there's so many other things to develop. But again, that's 50 chapters in a little more than an hour. But I want to pray, and here's the point in all of it. From the beginning, God created you to be with him. What he wants is a relationship with. But there is something between you and him. That free will and all the rubbish we've earned in that free will. Now, that doesn't mean we forgive it. We hand over our free will. What it does mean, though, is we make choices. The same way that in any marriage is not one choice. It is a choice to choose. I choose to choose my wife for the rest of my life. And I've been doing that for over 29 years now. In that same way, it's like I do agree to say I do for the rest of my life. He offers this and sends Jesus among his own brothers, rejected, sold for the price of slave, die on the cross for the sins of you and me, so that the price could be paid, and then raise again and come back alive again, just like the promised son that was of Abraham. When love and worship were introduced. Now, just like, and I don't have to convince you, that's the Holy Spirit's job, God the helper, who, by the way, just like in Abraham's case to get the bride, his job is to give you the offer. Your job is to make the choice. Will you say yes to that offer? You don't have to understand everything to understand this. Man, if God's offering you this and he's all you need, say yes and let the rest of it start to work its way out, because you start your journey on discovering how he's everything you need, just like Abraham, just like Isaac, just like Jacob, just like Joseph. The question is, are you willing to start that journey? Isn't that really where this is all about? Yes, God, I agree to follow you from this point, and I'm willing to go and discover who you're going to be in this. That's the choice you make. Well, would you pray with me?